Hello and welcome back to my channel, and this time I want to present to you my very first Supercut, in which I'm going to answer the question if we can lose Ultimate General Civil War. For this I cut down the footage as much as possible and remade the entire audio. I hope you are as excited as I am. Let's begin. Our orders were simple. Capture the small town of Philippi and its railway station before enemy reinforcements could arrive by train. We arrived on the battlefield and our vanguard advanced towards the enemy, but we marched directly into an ambush. In response, we took to the woods and had to deal with some additional skirmishes, but they were nothing but a small delay for our forces. Shortly after our first contact with the rebels, the rest of our force arrived and started to march towards our objectives. On the other side of the battlefield, we chased the skirmishers out of the woods with a quick charge and began to gather our forces for the attack on Philippi. On our left flank, artillery got into position to force McHenry out of his position, while our infantry started to surround the left part of the town. With everyone in position, the attack order was given and McHenry got expelled from his position as soon as our artillery opened up the bombardment, but also the rebel artillery got its first shots off. After we secured the left side of the city, we could form up the attack on our main objective. For this, an artillery battery was sent to the flank of our enemy. Our 6-pounders took position in the city with our main force. Zook and Walton engaged the entrenched rebels and tried to soften them up for our charge. Our 10-pounders arrived on their position and started to fire on the enemy flank. After a couple more salvies, Walton started his attack on the entrenched Law, but got quickly beaten back. Loomis followed in the second wave, but was also unable to achieve a breakthrough. With this, Zook followed as a third wave and was able to force the wall back, but was unfortunately unable to maintain his foothold and had to retreat back over the river. Walton tried to hold the gap, but was also forced back. Losses were already rising, and the bridge was full of our dead and wounded. After our first attack had failed, the men gathered in the city, while our skirmishers intensified their fire on the second bridge. Some good flanking hits from our dismounted cavalry forced Root to give up his position, clearing the way over the bridge. The rebels were unwilling to reinforce, and our skirmishers made a run for it. Shortly after, we set foot on the other riverside again. Whilst fighting on the first bridge intensified, our skirmishers located the enemy artillery and took position in town. Walton came to aid the outnumbered skirmishers and arrived just in time as enemy reinforcements marched towards Philippi. The defenders of the first bridge were finally forced back and Zook started to advance. Walton marched towards the town center and Loomis followed Zook to secure our second bridgehead. The Confederates tried to counterattack and charge us out, but Zook and Loomis held the position, whilst Walton opened fire on the enemy flank. Shortly after, the charge broke down, and with the town center in our hands, the Confederates had to abandon the city and prepared for a large counterattack. Our objective now was to hold the city against the multiple fresh brigades coming down the hill. And we would also have to face an armored train packed full with artillery pieces. Reinforcements would arrive soon, but it was not clear if we could hold out this long. A tough fight was upon us. The first wave of the enemy charged directly into Zook, who was holding our left flank, and only with the combined effort of our artillery and a charge from Bristol's cavalry we were able to beat them back. More brigades started to form up, but finally we heard that our reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. We heard the enemy locomotive in the distance, and with this the Confederates started their big charge. They saw a weak spot in our line and focused on our right flank, hitting our artillery hard. Loomis rushed over there to support our flank. At this moment, the second attack wave charged our left flank. Our reinforcements were still on the way, and the regiment of Zook broke completely, fleeing the battlefield. And if this situation wasn't bad enough, the armored train rolled down the tracks and opened fire on our lines. Facing this, we had to move back deeper into the city. Fresh forces were almost there, and the first artillery battery took position on the left side of the river. Our forces were under heavy pressure, and on the brink of collapse, Major Stockton was killed and his men, unable to fight any longer, capitulated. We were almost pushed out of Philippi, but at this moment the first units of our reinforcements rushed over the bridges. Thanks to the fresh troops, we were able to hold our ground and gradually force the rebels back. As the Confederates started to lose more and more ground, they began to gather around the movable fortress. Wheeler on the other side tried to sneak past our left flank, but was spotted by Colquitt skirmishers who ambushed him. Our next target was the armored train. All of our artillery pieces opened fire on it and forced it off the battlefield. With the heavy support removed and casualties mounting, the enemy lost more and more momentum. After a short rest, we took back our initial positions and started our counterattack. Enemy resistance broke down quickly as we hunted the last remaining units and charged Parrott's men off the battlefield. The rest of the day was spent harassing the retreating rebels, and shortly after, Philippi was secured. During this day of heavy fighting, we lost about 2,000 men, half of our fighting force. The rebels suffered even worse. With almost 4,000 casualties, they lost 2/3 of their initial strength. This trial by fire was a difficult test for us, but we succeeded. After some time to rest and to refill our ranks, we got a distress call while we were marching towards Washington. Our forces were evacuating a supply depot, but they needed more time. The rebels wanted to capture these weapons to support the war effort, and we needed to stop them. Our vanguard rushed ahead to aid the defenses. Rebels planned to attack from the north and over the river to our east. Soon the rest of our army would arrive. We needed to hold out until then. Our forces moved up to delay the enemy and soon made contact. They seemed hesitant at first. Apparently, they were not expecting us to put up a fight, but a volley of Loomis skirmishers broke the ice and the battle began. Seeing a chance, the rebel cavalry started a charge towards our northern supply depot, but were quickly forced back. At the same time, they started their attack over the river in our east. 2 infantry brigades charged over and forced our skirmishers back, while the rebels set up their artillery. In the northwest, we held our ground, and in the east the situation stabilized a bit, as we held the high ground and stopped the enemy from breaking through. Even though they were outnumbered, our men put up fierce resistance. More rebels appeared from the woods, now threatening our weak center and the back of our left flank. Richard's men marched into the gap to protect our flank and spotted the enemy artillery, but he was also greeted with a Confederate charge. Rebel artillery opened fire on friend and foe alike and shredded dozens of men with canister shots. One of the victims was Lieutenant Colonel Richards, but his men held firm, routing Dennis and then charged the battery to avenge their fallen brothers. Wharton's skirmishers gave chase to the fleeing Daniels. In the east, we held the enemy back. Evans tried to sneak past our lines, but he was spotted by Woods, who opened fire on him. In the north, Richard's men were still fighting the artillery crew as Dennis charged a second time. Wharton men did their best to support our brave heroes. At this time, the rest of our force finally arrived. Evans was beaten, but instead of retreating into the pocket, he stayed close to the riverbed, fleeing north in an attempt to link up with the rest of their force. Wood's skirmishers gave chase, while their parent unit marched towards the bridge to confront the artillery. In the northwest, Richard's men still fought tooth and nail against the rebels, and Wood's skirmishers charged in to break the deadlock, while further south, enemy cavalry continuously attacked the supply depot. The situation in the northwest, however, turned more and more into our favor. Seeing a weak spot in our defense, B's brigade bypassed our line and marched straight to our southern supply depot, which was until now undefended. Our cavalry tried their best to delay the enemy to buy time for our reinforcements. It was now getting clear that our forces would not arrive in time to protect the southern depot, and the Confederates started a daring charge to also bring the northern depot under their control. The first attack failed, and further south our fresh forces were finally ready to engage the enemy. In the east, Woods suffered heavy casualties in his fight against the artillery, and was now also getting flanked by Barlow's brigade. Our skirmishers rushed in to hit Barlow in the flank and back to hopefully force him off the battlefield. In the north, Richard's men and Ward's skirmishers sat between the Confederate lines and now started to roll up the enemy flanks, but our supply depot was under direct attack. Further south, our artillery opened up the bombardment and our infantry began to engage the enemy, but the rebels would not give up easily and brought in more reinforcements. After a heavy fight, Wharton was pushed out of his depot, but the rebels were unable to capitalize on this in time, and soon Wharton reorganized his men and rushed back into position. Heavy fighting ensued, and with Wharton's skirmishers finally freed up, they rushed south to assist their parent units. Poe's brigade pushed up as well and gave hell to the enemy. In the east, the rebels pushed back woods and wanted to go on the offensive, but they opened their flank to our skirmishers, who now tried to silence their guns once and for all. In the fight over the second depot, casualties were mounting and a breakthrough was far from being achieved. Further north, our exhausted men held the objective, as we were able to shoot the enemy from multiple sides. In an attempt to beat us back, B's brigade stormed out of the depot and attacked Stokes. Our artillery took target. On the northern front, we held our ground, but during the fighting, our divisional commander, Brigadier General Gibbon, was killed. As the fighting continued, we pushed back the enemy further, and Walton moved to our right flank to push back Walker. This fight was far from over, though Confederate resistance was tough. At the second depot, some of our forces were beaten back and a breakthrough was still not achieved. In the east, the enemy still resisted, but our skirmishers started a new attack on the artillery and set off a good volley. In the northwest, we finally broke down enemy resistance and were able to send Loomis to assist our attack on the second depot. Stokes was able to gather his men and send them back into the battle, while our artillery continued to shell the enemy. At the bridge, rebel artillery was on the retreat and were getting picked off by our skirmishers. As the fight continued, we were able to push the rebels to the right side of the battlefield, and Loomis arrived at the second depot, and at the bridge the last guns were silenced, allowing us to surround Barlow. Thanks to Loomis, we achieved fire superiority over the enemy and forced B out of the depot. Stokes marched in, while Stockton and Loomis would protect his flank from the rebel counterattacks. Our artillery moved up as well, and in the northwest the last desperate attack of the Confederates started, even though they were heavily outnumbered. Shortly before the end, things got dangerous again, as Evans, together with the remaining cavalry, tried to charge our right flank, but Post reacted quickly and rotated his men, while Loomis and our 6-pounders put down everything they had into the enemy ranks. After the last attack failed, the Confederates fired a few more volleys before retreating into the woods and clearing the battlefield. In the evening, the first casualty reports came in. We lost over 1,700 men and multiple officers. The rebels suffered gravely. In total, they had over 4,300 men dead, captured or wounded, a loss of almost 75% of their initial fighting strength. The mourning of the wounded accompanied us through the night and the next 3 days as we cleared the camp and left the position with the supplies. About a month after we answered the distress call, an opportunity arose to end this war quickly. The Confederates gathered their forces at Bull Run to protect Manassas Railroad Junction. We were ordered to attack and mobilized our forces. The plan was to distract the enemy. For this, we were needed to attack the stone bridge and to keep the rebels occupied. About 1 hour after our initial attack, our main force would arrive from the north and attack the left flank. We were then expected to push the rebels off the defensive line and to march east to finish them off. Our men arrived and got into position and were greeted by the enemy artillery before we could even see our target. Once in position, our batteries picked their targets and opened fire as well. Our troops got into position and the 1st Ohio was the first brigade to engage the enemy. Unfortunately, the rebels were able to sneak a cavalry unit behind our lines and attacked our artillery before we were able to reinforce with our skirmishers. After a short engagement, Clay's dragoons retreated and our skirmishers took position on the riverbank to guard our flank. This was a setback, but we were still ordered to capture the stone bridge. 1st Ohio therefore led the charge. Heavy fire forced them to fall back. The 2nd New York followed in the next wave and were able to reach enemy defenses. Unable to break through, they needed to retreat as well, but the 2nd Ohio continued the attack as our 3rd wave. The Louisiana Tigers were routed, but heavy fire on our flanks forced the men back over the river. During the retreat, the unit was devastated as canister shots shredded the back of the line. Clay's dragoon tried to capitalize on this and attacked our artillery before our units were back in position. The dragoons were able to attack multiple times, and together with artillery fire, our battery was about to be destroyed. Feeling confident, enemy skirmishers tried to charge over the bridge, but our lines were forming up again, and with the help of freshly arrived scout cavalry, we were able to hunt down the dragoons. Units were pulled back from the stone bridge as our main force arrived on the battlefield and marched towards the enemy. Taking advantage of this weakness, the 2nd New York started another attack. In the north, our men were attacked by the Confederates. The units were not yet in position and Marsh took heavy casualties, but this resistance brought enough time for the other units. At the bridge, the New Yorkers broke and fled the battlefield, but the men from Ohio started a new assault. Our main force slowly got into position and built up its strength to withstand the rebel attack. In the southeast, the enemy still put up a tough resistance, but we were able to push the skirmishers away from the defenses. Our cavalry now started an attack on the artillery. After that, they focused on the skirmishers to buy time for exhausted infantry to get into positions. The rebels started a new attack wave on our main force. Some of our units were at the risk of breaking, but we had more men in reserve to strengthen our position. After many failed attacks and a lot of bloodshed, we were finally able to secure the stone bridge and began to fortify our position. We could only hope that it was worth it. Our northern front held and the rebels were forced back, the perfect opportunity for our men to advance. Thankfully, more reinforcements arrived and were immediately sent to strengthen our weak position at the bridge. Close to Matthews Hill, our forces came under fire from the rebels. Our artillery moved forward to give support. Enemy efforts intensified to hold their ground, but more and more of our troops moved up. Reinforcements for the stone bridge were arriving just in time as the enemy prepared to attack our positions. The superiority of our force grew stronger and stronger, forcing the rebels to withdraw. Our new objective was to push towards Henry Hill and take it before Jackson's force could arrive. Our units pushed forward to hunt down the rebels as they retreated. On the right side on the battlefield, the Confederate counterattack was in full swing, and the 2nd Ohio broke before the skirmishers could reattach to their parent unit. Further south, more units arrived to attack the 1st Ohio. Thankfully, Keyes repositioned in time to prevent our line from breaking. In the meantime, our forces marched down from Matthew Hill, slowly working through the enemy defenses. Back in the south, a new attack wave broke our right flank, but our artillery was able to hold the enemy back for now. More rebels joined the attack on Stone Bridge, and it was unclear if we could hold this position. The ground turned into a mixture of mud and blood. Due to the constant fire, Keyes was forced back and multiple brigades charged our exhausted force. Through willpower alone, we held our ground and kept the fight going, occupying many of the rebel forces. Our main force finally arrived at the river and reinforcements were sent to the stone bridge. In the meantime, the rebel attack was beaten back, but the pressure was still high. An opening on the left flank of the enemy was a perfect invitation for 3 of our brigades to march through the river while our artillery moved forward. Howard and Post arrived at the stone bridge, a much-needed relief for our battered forces. More units crossed the river and cleared the woods of entrenched rebels. In the east, some brigades were stuck in the river, sitting ducks for our men, and as ammunition arrived, the bombardment of our artillery intensified, forcing the rebels back from the riverbed. Many of the wounded drowned, unable to keep their heads over the water. A short time later, the majority of our force had crossed the river and forced the rebels further and further back, but attrition started to take a toll and our men were exhausted. At this moment, Jackson's force arrived, bringing fresh units onto the battlefield. Shortly after they positioned themselves on the field, the first units charged our line. This attack wave was led by Barlow, who was fighting us the entire day. His attack broke cohesion in our lines and many units exposed their flank. All units were ordered to hold their position to prevent openings in our line. At the end, the rebels were unable to break our lines or to force us to retreat, but they achieved the goal. Thanks to the reinforcements and stiff resistance, we were unable to capture Henry Hill, ending this battle in a draw. We suffered close to 4,000 casualties, according to the report, but again, the Confederates were hit harder. With over 7,000 men lost, their casualties far outweighed ours. This was the main reason why this battle was not considered a defeat. Unfortunately for us, their morale was still high and this war far from over, but for now we have earned a rest. Our next objective sounded simple: cross the river and capture at least one of the 2 enemy-held hills to force them to retreat. If only we knew what hell we would march into. As our forces were closing in, artillery fire opened up on our men and we heard the yelling of charging rebels. Our first line got into position and a firefight ensued. More units committed to the attack and casualty quickly rose on both sides. Soon we were able to push the attackers back and laid eyes on our target while our forces moved forward. The rebels had positioned a strong force on the other side of the river and had 2 large artillery batteries firing down on us. Campbell's brigade tried to attack us but got stuck in the riverbed. Without cover, his numbers dwindled quickly. Trimble tried to support Campbell but got stuck as well. As we needed to cross the river, our men started to close in on Trimble and charged them head on, and at this point all hell broke loose. Taylor charged into our lines while we were shelled with artillery and shot at from multiple directions. Stokes' brigade was slaughtered. Before his men could flee, over 350 fell within a couple minutes, their wounded drowning in the now red river water. Our reserves filled the gap while our first line continued to die. As the fight raged on, we were able to set foot into the river once again. And again our casualties rose quickly as we marched up the other side and were now greeted with shrapnel shots from the enemy batteries and accurate fire from the Stonewall Brigade. Before long, more of our men were forced to fall back and more of our reserves were pulled forward. Additionally, enemy skirmishers proved to be a massive thorn in our side as they kept firing down our flanks. Loomis did his best to expel them, but his volleys seemed to have little effect on them. Because of that, Trimble was hit from multiple sides and was forced back. Post tried to take his position and Farrell had to move forward as Wharton's men fled the battlefield after they got torn apart by artillery fire. At last we chased off the enemy skirmishers and were able to intensify our attack. As the day continued, almost all of our units were engaged and a breakthrough was not achieved. Our casualties rose quickly and also the skirmishers came back to rain down on our flank. We still tried to move forward, stepping over our fallen friends. As the day dragged on, the madness continued. One unit got beaten back, another took its place, and as soon as our friends gathered their courage again, they got sent back into the meat grinder. The Confederates also suffered losses, but they held their ground, unwilling to hand over this hill, and as the general was unwilling to call for a retreat, we continued to die. With Trimble, the next brigade broke after they lost over 500 men and our flank was exposed again. After that, Allen's men couldn't continue anymore and dragged themselves into safety. Our last reserves were mobilized after Post's brigade was torn apart by artillery fire. Only a few were able to stumble back, shocked and disoriented, their uniforms, minds and bodies ripped into pieces. Wagner and Bench were ordered south in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, but more rebels showed up to stop them in the tracks. For a moment it looked like the enemy was falling back in the south, but as soon as our men advanced, they stepped into the trap. More rebels opened fire and Campbell charged into Wagner's flank. Within a few moments, 140 of his men were dead or wounded and he's forced to retreat. Branch's brigade was now isolated and charged as well. Under heavy losses, they were able to withdraw towards Wagner's position. The rebel counterattack continued and they slammed into our right flank. Loomis' men were annihilated, and finally the signal for the retreat was given. After this disastrous fight, we lost over 4,500 men, and only 6 out of the 12 brigades that we started the day with were still able to fight. The rebels, on the other hand, held their objective and only lost 3,000 men. We spent a lot of time licking our wounds and rebuilding our strength. Unfortunately, as soon as we were fighting fit, we got tasked with a new mission. This time we were ordered to hold Logan's Crossroad, as this would be the gathering point for the Ohio Army and the staging point for the attack on Mill Springs. Rebel patrols were seen in the forest and we had to hold out until our reinforcements could arrive. Our men rushed towards their positions around the objective, but before everyone was there, we were already greeted by the enemy. The rebels knew that they had the advantage and charged us head on. The small unit on our left broke immediately, but at this moment the rest of our forces started to appear. Fighting continued and every available soldier focused on the north, but suddenly more enemies started to attack our rear. Evans quickly relocated but had to endure fire on his flank. Luckily the rest of our force started to move up just as our lines were about to break. We still struggled to hold our ground and Evans was locked in brutal man-to-man combat, gradually losing ground. As the morning dawned, our counterattack began and our artillery opened fire. For a moment it looked like the turning point of the battle, but we were still getting shot at from multiple directions. As soon as one gap closed, another opened. More and more rebels charged into our spread out forces, creating chaos within our lines. Multiple units had to fall back, leading others to become isolated. Holding our ground was a desperate affair, and casualties rose quickly. Around 7 o'clock we were able to recover some of our lost ground, only to be flanked and forced back again. The rebels tried to crush our right flank and charged Evans. With this, the back of our line was partially exposed to the enemy. On our left, Fry and Wagner tried to flank the enemy to hold our line. Facing the risk of our line breaking completely, our artillery was ordered back, followed by our infantry. This gave the Confederates an opening to capture their objective, but with our force facing the risk of encirclement and complete annihilation, a withdrawal was necessary. We were still trying to get the upper hand, but the Confederates charged our line as soon as our men moved forward. We beat back that attack, but they continued to hold the line. Perhaps we could have pushed them back further, but the losses were high and we were exhausted. Fearing a repeat of the disaster of the last battle, the order was given to retreat. At the end of this day, 3,400 of our men were dead or wounded, while the rebels suffered 4,500 casualties. Our next goal was to take Corinth, and for this our forces got transported down the Tennessee River towards Pittsburgh Landing. We knew that the Army of Mississippi was active in this area, but allegedly they were unable to go on the offensive. Nevertheless, Pittsburgh Landing needed to be held until tomorrow so that the rest of our army could arrive. To make sure that the rebels can't surprise us, we spread out. Our camps stretched from the Shiloh church in the west all the way to the west bank of the Tennessee River in the east. Our scouts spotted enemy movement in the south, and we rushed into position to defend against everything the rebels might throw at us. To delay them as much as possible, our skirmishers took position in the woods. The skirmishers made contact with the enemy, but were on uneven footing. The first group of scouts ran directly into the enemy, unaware of the danger in front of them. Quickly they fell back, only to gather their courage and to start fighting once more. As more rebels appeared on the battlefield, our scouts needed to pull back. Major General Johnston was seen on the field as well. The rebels committed to a general attack. The skirmishers reached their next defensive positions and prepared to hold the rebels back as long as possible. Whoever thought that the Army of the Mississippi wasn't able to go on the offensive made a grave mistake. At the beginning, the Confederates were hesitant to move forward, unsure how many of us were hiding in the forest. Only the cavalry dared to move ahead. Luckily, we also received some reinforcements. They would be needed to withstand the storm that now started to form up on our lines. Our skirmishers did their job and could now start to withdraw to their parent units. On the east side of the battlefield, the first brigades opened fire on each other. On the west side, Franklin needed to close a gap in our line as the rebels got closer to the river. For now, our lines held firm and our reinforcements arrived to close gaps in our main line. In the west, a brigade of over 2,300 men started a charge and endangered our line. Thanks to Pratt's arrival, we could stop the first breakthrough of the enemy and held our position. Further south, Baldwin's men got flanked and caught in a melee just as they tried to retreat. Wagner gave as much cover fire as he could before he also withdrew to our main line. The rebel attack was now in full swing and rifle volleys echoed across the entire front line. But for the moment, our lines were holding. At the same time, rebels attacked our left flank. Our goal was it to hold the Spain field and the Leckenbell field. Quickly our men sprang into action and took defensive positions. Not long after, we made contact on our right flank. More rebels appeared. Luckily, they didn't know how weak our force was, or they would have charged us immediately. Additional forces marched towards us at the center of the field and on our right side. And with that, the first charge on this side of the battlefield started. Snow was wavering, but with help from our artillery, Cable's brigade and our cavalry, we were able to push them back. Our reinforcements arrived at the same time as Snow moved back into position. The additional forces were much needed. On the east side, another charge of the Confederates started. The first wave was beaten back easily, but the second wave nearly caught Cake, who was pursuing his fleeing attacker. Cake ran back to his previous position just in time, and all brigades opened fire. The enemy tried to push our lines, but for now our positions were holding tight. As the fighting continued, some units started to run out of ammunition. In an attempt to find a weak spot in the enemy lines, Rowley's cavalry tried to outflank them on the right side, but found strong artillery units instead. He still tried to break through, but was beaten back under heavy casualties. At the center, Wagner was pushed back and the rebels started another charge. Thanks to artillery, we were able to beat back this attack, and further left, our cavalry gave supporting fire to break the morale of another Confederate brigade. In the meantime, Rowley to break through the artillery again, but was routed. The rest of our forces were holding their ground and forced back a couple enemies, but our losses started to add up. Snow's brigade faced heavy fire. To prevent him from breaking, Martin's cavalry dismounted and opened fire on Pond's exposed flank. With their quick-loading rifles, they were able to inflict many casualties on the enemy. Soon after Martin took up the fight, Pond had to withdraw. On our right flank, more units moved up and proved to be great target practice for our soldiers. So far, our lines held. As the Confederates attacked us further, we were ordered to retreat to the Hornet's Nest. At the same time, we were expected to hold Shiloh Church as long as possible to delay the enemy. Our men started their retreat and prepared to form up a new defensive line, but the rebels were on our heels trying to catch us. Our supply wagons also entered the battlefield, giving us access to the much needed ammunition. Back at Shiloh Church, our men were in grave danger. Wood's brigade broke into our line and 2 of our units were forced back. A short time later, the situation was controlled. Franklin was able to push Wood back and our men retook their previous positions. Close to the Tennessee River, our forces retreated further but struggled to form a new defense. Previously, Martin used an opportunity to slip behind enemy lines and try to destroy enemy artillery. Unfortunately, neither he nor his men made it back to our lines. After a couple of minutes, most of our men were in position and a new defense line formed at the Hornet's Nest. Our supplies were also about to arrive, and with Nelson's division, we received some much needed reinforcements to strengthen our forces. At Shiloh Church, the fighting got more and more desperate, but for the moment we were still holding our position. Close to the Hornet's Nest, the rebels started a new attack wave, forcing our units back gradually. In an attempt to strengthen our forces, some of our brigades joined together. On our right flank, more Confederates charged our exhausted line. The battle raged on, but for now our line was still holding together. In the middle of our line, some units moved forward, put pressure on the enemy, and were able to repel a charge on their position. More problems arose at Shiloh Church. After holding out for the majority of the day, one of our brigades finally broke and fled the battlefield. At the same time, the rebels started a new charge on Schaefer's men. Unable to hold his position much longer, we gradually retreated. Unable to withstand the heavy fire, the center of our right flank also got pushed back for a moment, but were able to join the fight again shortly. The rest of our line held, making sure the rebels couldn't use the situation. Shortly after they retook their positions, the rest of Brewer's force got cut down and fled the battlefield. To close the gap, our lines got shortened. Fighting continued and more rebels formed up on our right flank. Thankfully, our artillery was supporting us and some of our larger units were holding these woods. Close to the church, the rebels focused on our center, but for the moment this flank was holding out. Back in the east, Wagner's brigade gave up and fled the field. Our units closed the gap, even though it put our flank in danger. Shortly after, the rebels tried to break through, but Emmon's men held them back. After suffering massive casualties, Schaefer's brigade broke as well. Wood continued his attack and was able to force Porter back. Pratt, however, charged into Wood's rear, desperately trying to hold our line. Together with supporting fire and artillery volleys, Wood was forced back. Pratt gave chase and fell back just in time as another brigade started to charge us. In the meantime, our left flank got pushed back to our artillery. We couldn't hold our positions anymore and had to retreat further. Pittsburgh Landing was our last line of defense. We needed to hold this position or we all faced the danger of getting encircled and overrun. The only silver lining on the horizon were the USS Tyler and USS Lexington, who were ready to bombard every enemy that came too close. Chaos ensued within our lines as we desperately tried to pull off a fighting retreat. All cohesion broke down as our lines collapsed simultaneously. Over at Hornet's Nest, we tried to pull back, but the rebels already breached our lines. The combined brigade under Bliss was overrun, but we were also able to destroy their attackers. This, however, was the last good news, as Cutler's brigade broke directly after. The retreat from Shiloh seemed to be going okay, but our men were spread out and demoralized. And if this wasn't bad enough, at least one Confederate unit snuck behind our lines and now sat in Pittsburgh Landing. We quickly sent men to clear out our objective. The rest of our force should follow soon. Stetson Brigade and a cavalry unit had snuck behind our line and were now trying to encircle us. We desperately attempted to force Stetson back so that the rest of our force could retreat, but at the same time, organized resistance in the south broke down. Further in the west, we got hunted out of the woods and another unit had to flee the battle. In the south, our retreat was halted by the rebels. Cake was flanked and ran for his life, while Ammon got attacked from multiple sides. With no other choice left, his men laid down their arms and capitulated. Panic spread among our ranks. At Pittsburgh Landing, only one unit of skirmishers and artillery held the positions, but they were hit hard when cavalry attacked them. Another brigade broke as we struggled to get closer to our objective. After heavy casualties, we were able to force Stetson back, and whatever was left of our force was about to link up, but the rebels were directly behind us. Baldwin's brigade decided to stay behind to buy as much time as possible, and for a brief moment they alone were holding back an entire rebel army before they retreated to our lines. In the northwest we were able to fend off an enemy attack. Of course, Stetson reappeared on our left flank. Wagner and Bruce prepared to fend him off. Shortly after we were able to push Stetson back, more rebels appeared and charged into Wagner's flank, while we were desperately shortening our defensive line. A new attack wave began and crushed our right flank. Porter would now take position within the defensive. For a short while our supply wagon gave up, but after a few words from our general, they came back to our side. Outside of the defenses, we were losing more and more ground and started to retreat. This, however, came too late for Baldwin, who was finally broken by an enemy charge. We now gave up on holding the outside of Pittsburgh Landing and retreated into cover. We all knew that the fight was long lost, but we still carried on, hoping for a miracle. As soon as our units were somewhat in position, the rebel charge began. For a short while our units held, but our numbers dwindled more and more. The last nail in the coffin was when Jenkins' cavalry forced our artillery back and Review started his charge on our line. He crushed Porter and more units followed through. Our men did everything they could to force him back. Bruce even charged out of cover, but his attack broke down instantly. Our artillery tore deep holes in the enemy lines, but more men kept on coming. The rebels overran our position. Whoever could tried to escape. Others chose to sell their lives as costly as possible. Soon after, our spirits broke and we had to lay down our arms. We were completely outnumbered and there was no reason to continue the fight. Later we found out how heavily we were outnumbered. In total, the Confederates attacked us with more than 37,600 men, but they also lost close to 19,000 of them. Our army was completely destroyed. At the beginning of the day we were around 20,200 men. In the evening, less than 6,000 remained, and of those only half of them were able to escape. The rest, who were still on the battlefield, became POWs and were transferred to one of the many prison camps in the Deep South. Hope to return home was high though, as during this time prisoner exchanges were on a regular basis. For those who weren't exchanged until mid-1863, a time of extreme suffering started, as the system broke down. The situation in the camps was bad before, but after this the real hell began. Many died in the overcrowded camps, where they were held in inhumane conditions. And this was the end of our journey in the American Civil War. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I certainly had fun making it, and if you have tips or recommendations, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I hope to see you all next time.